This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 1775. It's April 19th, 1775, 250 years ago. We are in Massachusetts at the key moment in U.S. history. Paul Revere has ridden the night before, warning that British troops are coming to fight the colonial revolutionaries. We all know the story. Fighting breaks out in Lexington and Concord. There's a so-called shot heard round the world at the North Bridge. The British are repelled, and the War of Independence is afoot. Classic stuff. But it may be that there should be a small coda to that story, another series of events on that same day, perhaps more consequential, and a third town. So let's ask why the tale of the start of independence doesn't talk about Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy. So here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
One answer might be that Menotomy is just a little harder to pronounce than Lexington and Concord. I'm just going to say it. It might just be that. But I do want to get to this town and the fighting there and whether it actually was more consequential than the ones that end up in the fifth grade textbooks. But let's tell the story of how we at least get to the troops showing up in Menotomy. I mentioned Paul Revere. You want to pick up the story there after Paul Revere does his fateful ride?
Yeah, so I feel like, I did not grow up in Massachusetts, but this is like, if you did, these stories are part of like the fabric of your lives. Like there's field trips that take you out to Lexington and Concord. I've walked those fields many times before. There's trails where you can sort of walk in historical markers, if you will. But it's during this time that, the British had been planning to make this attack to try to find out where the colonists were holding their arms and all of their supplies. Old North Church plays a major role in this because they, famously sort of hold up the light that says if they're coming by land or if they're coming by sea. And this is where Paul Revere makes his ride, basically telling people that the British are coming. And they do, in fact, come and they get to Lexington where it's sort of the first shots are heard. But it doesn't just stay in Lexington and it doesn't just stay in Concord either. This entire area is one that's being contested by the British and one in which we tend to forget the chaos that plays out in Menotomy.
And just so people have the geography in their head, that there is no longer a town of Menotomy, which, by the way, means swift running water in Algonquin. But the town is now, that's Arlington, Mass, basically. So, Lexington and Concord, and then Arlington is the neck of the woods that we're talking about. So about 700 troops show up in Lexington that day. Then they move between the two towns. I mean, these towns are like 5 miles apart?
Yeah,
we're not talking about that far of geographically. I think next year we will do a little bit of what was the first shot? Who shot it? There's all sorts of questions about that.
No one really knows,
Yeah, exactly. But the British charged forward after the first shots with bayonets. And there was basically chaos. 8 militiamen are killed. And then I guess maybe that's kind of where the story often ends for a lot of people. And then I think the next thing that happens is the British actually have to kind of retreat, but they don't just like disappear into nowhere. They retreat into this town, a third town, Menotomy, and more fighting breaks out there, which we will get to in a second. But now that we've moved the chess pieces into place, what is Menotomy? Where is it? And what do we need to know about that town?
Well, its location is particularly important because the reason Menotomy comes into the story is that the British are retreating back to Boston. And if you're retreating back to Boston from Lexington, you're going to go through this town of Menotomy. It also matters because it's a kind of crossroads town, which is to say it is one of those places that's kind of easy to get to from everywhere. And you have all of these people in the surrounding areas who have heard about the British attacks on Lexington and Concord, and they start streaming into Menotomy, so much so that by the time the British are retreating, there are like 5,000 armed colonists who are in this town of Menotomy. So by the time the British get there, something's going to go down. The question of what goes down is actually down to somebody we should talk about named William Heath. William Heath, not as famous as Paul Revere, at the time had never led a battle or anything like that. He wasn't really part of the military in any formal way. But what he was a military nerd. And so he had read all of these books about military maneuvers and fighting. And what he realized is like, we've got all of these people, but we don't have any artillery. We don't have like big cannons and things. So if we try to just like line the streets and shoot the British as they're coming in like a face-to-face battle, we are going to lose. So he decides to try something else, which is basically guerrilla warfare. Mm-hmm. We hide, and then after the British have come into town, then we come around behind them and ambush them. And that's ultimately how the fighting in Menotomy starts.
Yeah. William Heath is described in some books as a portly, nearly bald-headed farmer. So, I mean, first off, not surprising, maybe, given that description, not the stereotype, that he's more of a military nerd than an actual out-in-the-streets brawler. But it is so important to point out people just found themselves in this battle. People were, this was just, it would show up in your town, and now it's like, what are we going to do about it? And so the idea that he's basically rounding up civilians and his neighbors and saying, okay, that's an empty building at the end of the block. Let's use that for this. Let's hide behind this. Like that is really how a lot of this stuff went down kind of in real time over the course of hours.
And work to make them quite successful, because I think part of the downfall of the British was twofold. One, when they're coming back from Lexington and Concord, they're exhausted, like they're tired. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They have marched all night. They have still lost people. They have people who are wounded. But also because the British military was so highly regimented, and also wore these bright colors, you could spot them and you could sort of catch them while they were trying to ready themselves, and they weren't prepared for that kind of guerrilla warfare. The idea of like sort of ready, fire, aim was very much the way that they practiced warfare. It was like a gentleman's war. So the idea that you're hiding behind a barn or that you're popping out from like sort of a side street was almost considered to be not fair fighting.
Yeah, and uncivilized, right? They would be compared to indigenous people, that like they're fighting like wild people instead of like, civilized British subjects. Yeah. And in addition to the British being tired, Kellie, they were pissed off. They were mad that they were turned away from Concord and Lexington, and so by the time they're dragging themselves into Menotomy, they're led by a guy who would go on to become the Duke of Northumberland, Hugh Percy, and he was also he was pretty annoyed and upset with the colonists and their move toward breaking with Britain. And so they get to Menotomy and they start looting. They're even before they're engaged by all of the colonists who are there, they're already sort of out of pocket anyway. Yeah. And then the fighting breaks out, and it is, Jody, as you were describing earlier, it's like hand-to-hand combat. Yeah. It's long arms, it's bayonets, and it's happening in these like small city streets and in buildings. So like in one guy's house, 10 people die. Because they're fighting in the cellar, they're fighting on the first floor, they're fighting in the attic. It is a kind of gruesome warfare that's taking place here. And this is one of the reasons Menotomy is important. Half of the people who die that day die in Menotomy. Yeah. The rest die around Lexington and Concord, but this was the deadliest site of the fighting.
And a high number for civilians as well. These are not just soldiers. I mean, women and children are also living in these towns, and if you caught a stray bullet, if someone charged into your home, you were slaughtered.
So the British lost 40 were killed and 80 wounded. The colonists lost 25 people. And that's far deadlier than what happened in Lexington and Concord on that day. The British also, I think it's really important, that picture of them as kind of beleaguered and sort of pissed and fracturing. And so there's a lot of looting that goes on. There's rumors that some British soldiers had stolen silver from the communion at the local church. And I think that looting becomes part of the story the colonists tell themselves as well, about the kind of behavior and moral character of the British.
I'd also say, you mentioned that there are the locals who are involved in the fighting. I mean, these were just regular people who knew that the British were coming through their town. There's a 78-year-old guy named Samuel Whitmore who attacks when the British come through. He kills 3 British regulars, and then he is think he's like shot in the face or something. And they just assume that he's dead, right? That's what happens when you get shot in the face. He'd been bayoneted several times, but he ultimately lives. He ends up living until he's like 96 years old. And that becomes kind of, even though he's not a name that we know, it is so symbolic of the story Americans will tell themselves about this moment, right? We're outgunned, we're outmanned, we fought harder than anyone, and when they knocked us down, we got back up again. Do your Chumbawamba thing here. But that's the spirit of the day. And so stories like that of ordinary people become really important in sort of the myth making around this moment.
Yeah. And so much ordinary people, because a lot of the colonists had really not been trained or prepared in this way for warfare. I mean, they are literally sort of picking up the bayonets that they have at their disposal and sort of making a go at it. I mean, there are people certainly that had fought in wars before or had military training, but when you're in these small towns, you know, people are just trying to navigate what they feel like is an invasion.
Let me take a moment to tell you about Key Change, a new project from one of the legendary Radiotopia shows, Song Exploder. So as you know, in Song Exploder, musicians tell a story of how they created one of their songs. Well, this new series is not about the songs that people made, it's about songs that made people who they are. It is still hosted by Rishikesh Hirway, and he talks in each episode to a guest about a piece of music that was transformative for them. The guests are incredible. I just finished listening to the episode with Hanif Abdul-Rakib talking about The Clash. Hanif, Rishi, The Clash, basically my perfect podcast conversation. Comedian James Acaster talks about Outkast. The actress Sophie Thatcher talks about Elliott Smith. And if I'll just add, if you listen to Song Exploder, one of the beauties of it is that Rishi really lets the artists kind of speak in their own words. But I happen to be lucky to call Rishi a good friend of mine. I know that he's a lovely person to chat with, and I really love that in this new series we really get to know him as well as the fantastic people that he is talking to. Also, another little aside, no one names things better than Rishi. Song Exploder is great, Home Cooking is great, and this new one works in a couple ways too. Key Change, nicely done. So, if you're already subscribed to Song Exploder, you're going to get it. If not, what are you waiting for? You now have both Song Exploder and Key Change to go dive into. Key Change comes out once a month in the Song Exploder feed or at songexploder.net/keychange. This episode is brought to you by Quince. So let me tell you how I spent a recent Sunday morning. We have this big wall calendar in my house, the whole year at a glance. And a couple times a year, we take it off the wall and fill it out with our plans. This most recent time, it was all about spring and summer travel, laying out the windows where we are going to try and take some fun trips. And guess what we will need on those trips? Some great luggage. It is time to travel in style, folks, and this year I am treating myself to the luxury upgrades I deserve with Quince's high-quality travel essentials at fair prices. Quince has premium luggage options and stylish tote bags to carry it all. And while you're on your trip, you are of course going to want to look good. Quince has lightweight European linen styles from $30, washable silk tops, comfy lounge sets. I just picked up a couple great pairs of new sunglasses, one for the car, one for my suitcase. People used to travel in style, folks, and I am doing what I can to bring it back. And of course, all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. So for your next trip, treat yourself. Go to quince.com/thisday for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. Happy travels. So, as we return to this question of why this chapter of this day is not part of the big story that gets told about the start of the war, it feels like the Battle of Menotomy reinforces some of those very apocryphal key stories that we like to tell ourselves, and then other parts really complicated. So the parts that reinforce it, I think, are what you just said, Kellie. Like, it proved that the plucky colonists were able to band together and outwit the slow, regimented British army. It proved public support was eroding for the British. The part that made all that trickier and maybe kind of indicates why it doesn't enter into the public imagination is, I think, some of the brutality of it. I mean, even at the time, the legislature of Massachusetts Bay referred to the battle as, quote, barbarous devastation, almost beyond description, plundering and burning of dwelling of houses, driving into the street women in childbed, killing old men in their houses unarmed. And part of that might be propagandistic, to try and talk about the British as the war is raging on. But part of that is a depiction of something that just kind of is hard to sit with. And Kellie, you think about sort of violence and the political imagination so much. Is it that this was a little too violent, a little too uneasy for it to kind of become part of a tidy story?
Absolutely. I mean, like, even when you go to Lexington and Concord to visit those places, it's like a field, it's walking trails. And so in your mind, you have this reference of, oh yeah, this is where battles would take place, on a big open field where everybody lines up and there's some sort of like order to it, if you will. But that takes on a completely different tone and tenor when you're inside of a town and when you're inside someone's house and when you're hiding in a store. It feels much more pedestrian, much more higher numbers of civilian casualties. And I think that story is not as heroic or romantic to tell because it doesn't line up with the sentimentalities of like the field and, sort of like the battle as we might imagine in Mel Gibson's Patriot. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to be like, it's not so romanticized or Hollywood.
And it's this tricky balance that leaders during wartime have to face, which is you want to rile up sentiment against your enemies.
Yep.
And certainly that description you read, Jody, will make people think those evil, evil British, we've got to get them out of here. But also you don't want them so terrified that they don't want to fight back because they don't want to invite that into their homes. And I think that's what you're talking about, Kellie, that line between we're out on the battlefield fighting, or even with like the Boston Massacre, right?
Yeah.
Like that you as just like your individual in your home, you will be safe. That there has to be like a safe zone in a war. And so maybe that's one of the reasons this doesn't get.
And the colonists are successful at Lexington and Concord. They see it as their first battle that they have won against the British. The British are retreating. So that's a story you can tell that has a lot more victory attached to it.
Yeah, for sure.
And actually the ambush and ambushee get mixed up here too, right? Like at Lexington and Concord, they're prepared because Paul Revere warns them, but they were being ambushed by the British. If ambush is a little dishonorable, that's what the Americans do in Menotomy.
Yeah, for sure. Even though it's kind of the British show up in their town, they still then take on those tactics. Yeah. Well, look, we've talked about it on the show before, but next year is the big 250th anniversary. We can see this is kind of the kickoff of that in many ways, right? And it will be really fascinating to see how these stories get pushed further towards simplicity or whether there is a conversation about the kind of things we're discussing here. But I think you can see that basically for 250 years, that history has been sort of actively written and rewritten and contested up until this very moment. And, this isn't the official kickoff of our 250th coverage, but we can consider this the podcast heard around the world. This is our sort of opening shot, and we'll go from here. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.